Welcome to Americana Archives. Today's headline is White House Brides. It says, "What has become of the White House brides? There have been 12 of them. Miss Jessie Wilson will be number 13, but she feels no superstitious alarm on that score, 13 being the luckiest of numbers in the Wilson family. It's interesting to consider the fact that 3 of the round dozen of White House brides, including the first one, Lucy Payne, and the last one, Alice Roosevelt, married congressmen. Also that 2, Della Lewis and Nellie Grant, became the wives of foreigners. Only one president, Mr. Cleveland, was married in the White House, although another, Mr. Tyler, took to himself a spouse during his term of office. In earlier days, White House weddings were always celebrated in the circular room, the State Department, oval in shape, which is now called the Blue Room. But of late years, Washington society has expanded to such an extent, numerically speaking, that with perhaps 1,000 guests to be invited, the East Room is none too large for the staging of so important a spectacle as a marriage in the White House. At the wedding of Alice Roosevelt, which occurred February 17, 1906, the East Room was almost uncomfortably crowded. The bridal pair were wed on a raised platform before an extemporized altar. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Henry Y. Satterley, Bishop of Washington, and breakfast for 60 persons was served in the state dining room, a buffet lunch for the other guests being furnished in the green room. Nick Longworth, at that time a member of Congress from Cincinnati, is exceedingly popular. He can do amusing things with the piano, is a first-class baseball player, and has other accomplishments. At the date of his marriage, he was nearly 40. Though not rich, he will eventually inherit a considerable fortune from his mother. His wife has spent most of her time since her marriage in Washington, where she is a leader of the Young Married Women's Set. She has no children. There was a gap of nearly 20 years between the Roosevelt wedding and that of Frances Folsom, who was married in the White House June 2, 1886, to President Cleveland. She was only 20 years old at the time and was the daughter of Mr. Cleveland's former law partner. On this occasion, the ceremony was semi-private, and the Blue Room was plenty big enough for the bridal party and a small number of invited guests. When her husband died 5 years ago, Mrs. Cleveland was left very well off. In addition, Congress voted her the customary $5,000 a year as the pension of a president's widow. A few months ago, she was married to Thomas J. Preston. When Rutherford B. Hayes was colonel in the 3rd Ohio Volunteers, the lieutenant colonel of the regiment was Russell Hastings. Whence it came about that Colonel Hastings, in later years, made the acquaintance of Emily Platt, a niece of President Hayes. Miss Platt was a member of the White House family through the Hayes administration, being regarded almost as a daughter. When she became engaged to Colonel Hastings, it was arranged that she should be married in the White House, and the ceremony was performed there on June 19, 1878, at 7 o'clock in the evening. It was wholly a family affair. 4 years earlier took place the wedding of Nellie Grant, the 3rd daughter of a president, to be married in the White House. On this occasion, the spectacle was staged in the East Room, then used for the purpose for the first time. The date was May 21, 1874, and the bridegroom was Algernon Charles Frederick Sartoris, an Englishman. Ellen Renshaw Grant was a handsome girl of 18, with brown hair and eyes, rosy cheeks, and a plump figure. Sartoris, who was the son of a member of Parliament and was said to have an income of $60,000 a year, met her for the first time on a steamer coming back from Europe. The wooing was rapid, but General Grant disapproved of the match and did not give his consent for more than a year. There are plenty of people living today who well remember the popular excitement caused by this international marriage. It was estimated that the wedding presents represented a value of more than $100,000. Certainly, no marriage ever started out with a fairer outlook, but unfortunately, the prospect was not realized. Sartoris, who was an idler, like many Englishmen of his class, did not make a satisfactory husband, and Mrs. Sartoris was eventually compelled to divorce him. Her son, named Algernon after his father, recently married a French girl, Cécile Mouflard, and is now residing in France. 2 daughters are married. A little over a year ago, Mr. Sartoris having meanwhile died, Mrs. Sartoris took a second husband, Frank Hatch Jones, being married to him on July 4th, 1912, at Cobourg, Canada. On the evening of January 31st, 1842, Elizabeth Tyler, third daughter of President Tyler, then a girl of 18, was married in the Blue Room of the White House to William Waller, a member of Congress from Williamsburg, Virginia. It is not quite possible, in all instances, to trace the subsequent history of the White House brides, some of whom, indeed, such as those of the Jackson administration, were persons of no prominence apart from the fact that they were married in the White House. Soon after this marriage, Mrs. Tyler died, and within a short time, the widowed president took to himself a second wife, whose name was Julia Gardner. She was a New York girl. Returning from abroad with her father, Miss Gardner visited Washington and met President Tyler. Soon afterward, President Tyler became engaged to Miss Gardner, and they were married in New York, the bridal party returning immediately to the White House, where the wedding reception was held. Mr. Tyler was 56, and his bride only 20. John Quincy Adams, then in Congress and a bitter enemy of the president, spoke of this marriage as a union of January and May. Young Mrs. Tyler did the honors of the White House for 8 months, until the close of the administration. Then she and her husband went to their Virginia home, where they lived 17 years. When Mr. Tyler died, his widow took her children to her mother's home at Carlton Hill, Staten Island, and there spent the rest of her life. When Van Buren was president, Dolly Madison was still the leader of Washington society, and it was she who introduced to him the beautiful Angelica Singleton, daughter of a distinguished South Carolina family. Miss Singleton became a frequent guest at the White House, and the president's son, Major Abram Van Buren, fell in love with her. He married her in November 1833 at her home in South Carolina, but the wedding reception was held at the White House, where young Mrs. Van Buren immediately took charge of affairs as mistress of the establishment, the president being a widower. Andrew Jackson was remarkably devoid of relatives. Perhaps it was on this account, and because he was fond of young people, that he made so much of his wife's relations. 2 of the latter were married in the White House at his request during his administration. A third young woman who enjoyed the same distinction was Della Lewis of Nashville, the daughter of an intimate friend of the president. The second marriage at the White House during the Jackson regime was that of Mary Easton, another Tennessee girl, who was a niece of Mrs. Jackson. In this instance, the bridegroom was Lucian H. Polk, likewise of Tennessee. The pair went to live at Columbia, Tennessee, where they spent the rest of their lives very happily. Elizabeth Martin was a relative of Mrs. Jackson's. She was married in the White House to a young clerk, Louis Randolph, a son of Martha Jefferson Randolph, who was the eldest daughter of Thomas Jefferson. This takes us back as far as the administration of John Quincy Adams, who had 3 sons. The handsomest of the 3 brothers was John Adams, a graduate of Harvard, notoriously hot-tempered and inheriting the arrogance of his grandfather after whom he was named. At that time, a young man named Helen from Philadelphia was employed in the White House in a secretarial capacity. He had a very pretty sister named Mary, and John Adams fell in love with her, finally obtaining the consent of his parents to their marriage, notwithstanding some opposition to start with. The ceremony was performed in the circular room, and there was dancing afterward, the president and his wife taking part in the Virginia Reel. It has been said of the Monroes that they made fewer friends in Washington than any presidential family before or since. They were very exclusive and so formal that Mr. Monroe once refused to see a near relative who called at the White House because the visitor was not attired in the small clothes appropriate to full dress. Mrs. Hay, the eldest daughter, would not visit the wives of the diplomats because they did not call first upon her. Thus it came about that when the youngest daughter, Maria Hester Monroe, married her cousin, Samuel Lawrence Governor, then secretary to the president, nobody was at the wedding except members of the families of the bride and bridegroom. It took place in the circular room at noon on March 9, 1820, and the clergyman, the Reverend Dr. Hawley of St. John's Church, wore knee breeches with silver buckles on his low shoes. The couple spent their summers at Oak Hill, Loudoun County, Virginia. They lived in New York in winter. Ex-President Monroe died in the New York house while on a visit to his daughter. They had 3 children, 2 of them boys. Maria Monroe Governor died at Oak Hill at the age of 49 and was buried there. Anna Todd of Philadelphia was married at the White House in 1812 to John G. Jackson, a member of Congress from Virginia and a grand-uncle of Stonewall Jackson. History is unfortunately silent in regard to subsequent events in the life of Anna Todd, but it is known that she went to Virginia with her husband and lived there the rest of her life. Dolly Madison had 2 sisters. One of them, Anna, became the wife of Congressman Cutts of Maine. The other and younger sister, Lucy, was married at 15 years of age to George Steptoe Washington, a nephew of the father of his country. He died and she went to live with the Madisons. All of which merely leads up to the fact that on the evening of March 11, 1811, Lucy, the widow aforementioned, was married at the White House to a Kentucky widower named Todd, who was an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. This was the first White House wedding and was celebrated with all the eclat possible in those comparatively simple days. It will be noticed that only 4 of the 12 White House brides have been daughters of presidents. The first of these was Maria Monroe, the second Elizabeth Tyler, the third Nellie Grant, and the fourth Alice Roosevelt. Jessie Wilson will be the 5th. This article came from the great state of Oklahoma, being reported in the Farmer's Champion of August 28, 1913. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.